In this video, I'm going to talk about the difference between a controlled landing on a project and a crash landing. Have you ever wondered when you get in trouble near the end what you should do, how you can manage that, and what is the best way to finish that project on time? Well, we're going to talk about all of these concepts in this video right now. So I'm really excited about this topic. There's a big difference between a controlled landing and a crash landing. And I'm going to use my flip chart to explain it. So here we go. So when I imagine a project, and by the way, I want to give a shout out to my homies at DPR, Derek Kirkland, Ryan Young, and their marketing department. This is where I first learned about this concept. But when I envision a crash landing versus a controlled landing, I imagine this plane taking off and going in flight and then landing at its destination, right? A controlled landing would be that your descent is proper, that you land on the runway on time, right, safely, and that you had a pretty smooth ride throughout. But we know that construction really isn't like that. We know that there's a lot of different times where we have difficulty. So how do we manage turbulence in the air, and how do we manage a landing if you get in trouble? So going along with this analogy, I do want to just quickly note, in order for you to have a good flight, you must have your pre-flight takeoff. That means that early on in pre-construction, you have your teaming meetings, your conditions of satisfaction, you're talking to the owners, you have a really, really great pre-con experience, right? We learned from the book How Big Things Get Done that projects don't go wrong, they start wrong. So this is huge, right? Then you're starting the project, you're ascending to the right altitude, and you're attempting to find a good cruising speed. Now, unfortunately, I've flown probably up to around 2,000 times in my life, and I know all about flights and how we experience turbulence throughout. Now, I will say, when you experience turbulence up here, right? And again, I'm going to give a shout out to the DPR marketing team for teaching me this concept as well. When you on a plane experience turbulence, they slow down and they get more safe, right? If you've ever been on a plane, they'll say, everybody please put on your seatbelts, please restrict movement throughout the cabin, the flight attendants will sit down, and the plane will slow down and adjust and move to calmer air. They don't speed up, they don't panic, they don't rush, they don't push, right? So if you get into turbulence, that's the key. Now, if you get into trouble here at the end, and you're not on time, or they've overshot the runway, or let's say there's a storm, or something happens here, the pilot does not nosedive that plane and like crash it into the earth, right? That's not what we're looking for. Whether that pilot has to circle back around or has to start the descent earlier, or whatever he or she has to do, there's calmness and there's control there. There's not panic. And so projects follow the same kind of a theme. And I want to talk to you about the difference between a controlled landing, okay, that's under your control, versus a crash landing. And I do want you to know the reason this is relevant is because most landings, for construction projects at least, in the construction industry today are crash landings, and I can tell you why, and I'm going to go through these one by one. All right, so I've written down some of the main reasons for a crash landing, or some of the main behaviors that you will see. And I want to preface this by saying, when we all grew up with our parents, and most of you, well, let me just assume that all of you had decent parents growing up, and you're on this video, you're a hard worker, you're doing a great job. We all learned from our parents that if we made a mistake, like let's say for instance, I spilled milk on the floor. If I was casually like, I'll get to that, right? Your parents would be like, what are you doing, right? Like get really upset. But if you're like, oh my gosh, let me get this, and run and get paper towels and clean it up, they're like, oh, he cares. Jason cares and is rushing to get that cleaned up because he cares. So my rushing and my panic and my concern and my worry and my sorries, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, prove that I care. And so that's what my parents wanted. They wanted to know that I cared, right? But that behavior in construction only hurts us. Meaning that when you have an owner, and I want everybody to hear me on this, when you have a project owner or a corporate team, a business owner, or a leadership team inside a construction company that sees a project is in trouble and now wants to see motion and movement and panic to see that the project team cares, you're only going to spiral that project out of control, right? There's a better way to do it. So we need to get away from the milk spilling analogy on construction projects, and we need to go back towards the flight analogy. When we get into trouble, we slow down and we are more safe. And when we get into trouble, we do not nosedive that plane. We control land that plane. Even if it's a crash landing, you control land it. You don't nosedive that thing, right? So I want you to know that in the 8 wastes, you have overproduction, excess inventory, motion, transportation. Because of that, you have defects. Defects take time to fix, which causes overprocessing, which creates waiting, which is all a waste because you didn't use the genius of the team. So what people don't understand with projects is that motion and busyness is waste. Let me say that again. Motion and busyness is waste. So we don't want to see it because those wastes will create other wastes and it will delay your project, right? So let's talk about these one by one. When you're in a crash landing, that's when you start to push. When I think about pushing, I think about somebody who is here and somebody behind, right? I hope you like my stick figures. Somebody behind that's pushing another character onto that person, and it's going to tip everybody over. We do not want to push. We want to get better at pulling people into areas, right? So because they're connected. So if this person's done and moving out ahead, it will pull that second person behind them. So we do not push, we need to pull. Pushing causes trade stacking and trade burdening. Pushing causes out of sequence work. Pushing causes safety problems. Pushing hurts people, right? It's going to overburden your resources. So when you're in a crash landing, you're definitely pushing people right here instead of preparing work and pulling contractors behind you. Let me go to the next concept, which is too much or too many. When you start to really get into a crash landing, you'll have too many materials, too many people, too much overtime, right? You'll start to add more and more and more, which hurts your project. Like I've talked to you about before, is because when you have too many people, now you have more people, you have larger team sizes, you have a harder time with communication, you now have changing leaders, changing crew composition. In the meantime, you start working overtime, which slows down your crews. You have additional onboarding time. People are now fatigued. Now they're starting to install work improperly. Now they have rework. Now they've lost track of planning. Now you have stops and restarts, right? So having too much is not good. You could add right now to all of your projects 10 people, 10 trained people per crew. But what good would it do if you're not ready? What good would it do if you don't have the RFIs? What good would it be if you don't have the areas ready? They would just be standing around. Too much means you're throwing money away, right? So if you're in a crash landing, you're starting to add resources to the point of overburden on your project site, right? The other thing that you're doing is you're batching. Instead of working crews from one area to another in a flow, like we've talked about before, you're starting to say work over here, here, all over the place. When you batch, now you're overburdening, now you have unevenness, now you have waste, and the biggest problem is you have context switching. So once you break these teams up and you say do all of these things, not only is there overburden, but when people switch tasks, you have 15 to 45 minutes minimum of wasted time, and with crews it can be up to a half a day or an entire day of context switching. So when you're in a crash landing, you have too much batching. When you're in a crash landing, you also begin to silo. That means that you don't ask your company for help. You don't ask neighboring jobs for help. You don't hire consultants for help. You're in a silo and your team starts to like really cover up and stops being transparent and doesn't tell anybody what's going on and doesn't, like I said, ask for help. And this is a really big problem because in order to like really land your plane in trouble, like that pilot's not doing it by his or herself, right? They're talking to the control tower, they're having other people help, they're dispatching EMTs and emergency services, right? We do not finish a project by ourselves. If you're in a crash landing, you will be in a silo, and that's always a bad idea. The other thing is you're always behind the 8 ball. If you're in a crash landing, that means that instead of planning work, preparing work, and being ahead, you're reacting. Now, let me talk to you about this because this is so important. When people say, hey, Jason, what can I do to recover my project? I always say to them, you start to do the basics better, right? You're going to do your pull planning. You're going to do your quality pre-construction meetings. You're going to keep it clean, safe, and organized. You're going to really hold to your huddles and do weekly work planning and look ahead planning. Focus on removing roadblocks. Steady. Steadiness is the game. You have got to be disciplined with this. So when you're in a crash landing, you're behind and you never catch up because you've stopped planning and preparing out ahead. And then finally, panic. When you're in a crash landing, you panic. And what I mean by that is that everybody's like panicking, pushing, rushing, blah, blah, blah. And you're probably like, Jason, if we're in trouble, that's what we want. No. Panic creates disconnection and people going in different directions and doing the wrong things, which creates rework, which then means that we're extending the project even farther. If you want to finish that project, the Navy SEALs had it right. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? And I would say steady is smooth and smooth is fast, right? You've got to slow down and really get through this in an intelligent way. Panic never, ever helps anybody because it has people running around doing the wrong things instead of gathering and doing the right thing together. So I'm now going to talk to you about what a controlled landing looks like. So here I've written down a couple of bullet points and I'll go through them one by one. Number one, you have a real end date, meaning that you're not arbitrarily moving up a milestone so that you can rush and push and panic people. You have a realistic end date that will allow your flow, meaning that there's an actual realistic path, not an impossible task, right? I'll talk about this separately, but there's these concepts in military history and in military doctrine called hobbling the army and then putting people on death ground. Hobbling the army is where you put the army or the military force, or in this case, the construction workers, into an impossible situation where they can't win. Okay? That is where you just rush and push and panic and give them an impossible task or an impossible milestone. The concept of putting them on death ground is where they're backed up against no escape, but they have a possible coordinated, planned attack ahead of them. That's where, like Sun Tzu said in the book, The Art of War, he would put the military's back in front of the mountain or a river where they couldn't escape, but they did have the people, the resources, the plan, the determination, and the wherewithal to actually attack their enemy. Putting them on death ground just means they didn't have an excuse to escape, right? So there's a big difference between hobbling the army, giving an impossible task, and putting them on death ground to engage their commitment, right? So your milestone should be a death ground milestone where they have to fight to get through it, but there's a coordinated plan and there is urgency, but it can't be all the way to the traumatic point of hobbling the workforce where it's impossible. So if you want to do a controlled landing, you have to have a real date, a real milestone, a real target. Just like in the plane analogy, right? You don't want to say, oh, land, and you're minutes away from the runway. You're going to crash land that thing and kill everybody on the plane. You need a realistic ramp to your end destination or to your milestone. Okay, that, by the way, this even means that if there's force majeure type delays, you might need to ask for a little bit more time. You will be better off asking for a little bit more time than crash landing to an improper date and overextending it by a lot. Okay, the second one, your controlled landing will have to have flow. That means that trades are working from area to area to area in a flow. That is the fastest way to finish a project. A lot of times people say, oh, Jason, you're saying extend the project by 2 weeks and get into a flow versus I could target my date, crash land, rush, and push, and we can meet the date. No, 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 that is not the equation. The situation is you can either ask for the right time and maintain that trade flow and finish 2 weeks late, or you can rush and push and panic and finish 2 to 4 months late, right? This is the problem. This is the equation that we're dealing with. Okay, number 3, if you want to control land your project, you will have consistent resources. Don't just go throwing labor, materials, and money at a problem or overtime, right? Or which is energy. Keep consistent trained resources in that flow and you will have a better chance of finishing. Okay, and I do mean to needed levels. So if you have a crew where you need 12 people and you only have 10, obviously get those other 2, but don't get 20 because that's only going to slow you down. All right, a coordinated path. So if you have a good milestone that has flow with consistent resources, you must have a coordinated path, meaning there has to be a realistic, logical, intelligent path to finish for this project. And then finally, it has to be clean, safe, and organized throughout. You can never let anybody compromise this. Okay, so it's very, very important. So here's the key. If you want to have a good flight on your project, take off well. Remember that projects don't go wrong, they start wrong. Get to your cruising altitude. If you hit turbulence, slow down and be safe. And when you're about to land, if you have trouble, if you've overshot the runway, running out of fuel, whatever the problem is, don't nosedive that plane and kill all the passengers. Work with the air traffic controllers and control that landing so you can be safe. So if you want to hurt your career and take the job and throw a lot of money away, I invite you to crash your project. If you want to finish it with safety, with healthy people, and with the highest possible profit and the smallest amount of delay, then make sure you have a controlled landing. And if you ever get into trouble, call us at Elevate, Lean Super and Lean Takt. We help clients recover projects all the time. We're a phone call away, and I hope you've enjoyed this video. On we go.